So there's been an increase in people opting to secure their household goods remotely. People are now apparently turning to private safety deposit boxes as load shedding increases the risk of break-ins to store their belongings. We're now joined to talk about the impact of load shedding on home security by Eldred De Klerk, a crime expert. Eldred, thank you very much for your time this afternoon. What intelligence are you getting when it comes to the direct correlation of load shedding on house breakings? Are we seeing an uptick?
Thank you. Thank you for looking at this critical topic at this time. In terms of doing a straw poll of all security companies working ostensibly in the Greater Cape Town area, there definitely has been an increase in opportunistic crime during load shedding hours, because what do we know? We know that you're either going to have no power and you're going to be in the dark. We also know that if you're at work and you have no power, it's likely that your alarm is not working. So your perimeter may be unprotected. And as such, thieves or robbers then use that opportunity to steal from around your house. And if they're brazen enough, to actually break into your house. So it's left people vulnerable. And I think this is the word your producer used. How vulnerable are we? And has that vulnerability increased? So we may not at this time be able to say that the number of incidences have increased, even though anecdotally we believe it has. What we do know is that people are feeling more vulnerable. And in fact, they are more vulnerable when they're either in the dark or the electronics, surveillance and alarms that they are depending on to keep themselves, their businesses and their family safe is not working. So there's an additional expense then. You said that people are now looking to secure their valuables in vaults, and often that incurs an expense that you go on with a bank. Most of us cannot do that. So yes, we are vulnerable, and yes, we are vulnerable to crime, and the nature of the crime has also changed.
You say the nature of the crime has changed. How?
Well, because what it meant is that people are now seemingly, robbers and thieves are now seemingly more determined to use the time when we have no power. And remember, load shedding is a word of something that Eskom does. What we experience is that we're without power. There's a power outage, yeah? So we're either in the dark or, as I said, our electronics are not working. We are then subjected to increased surveillance. So our movements are looked at. Our houses and homes and businesses are being studied for opportunities for when we are less vigilant or when we're simply not present or when our property is unprotected. So often we've seen that with house break-ins and theft, they often target the same place more than once because they know that once they've stolen from you, you are likely to go out and buy additional commodity goods. Yeah? So you replace that which is lost. Often they say, well, insurances will pay, so we replace. They then know where your home is vulnerable, and as a consequence, they use that same vulnerability to then break in and steal from you again. What we see now is that that's not necessarily the pattern. They're now moving on to other homes that is all equally vulnerable because either there's no one present or at home because it's during the day, or we are in the dark at night and our perimeters, the outside of our homes, our garages, our porches, our gardens, where often we leave quite expensive, implements and equipment laying around, or our vehicles are then more vulnerable.
That is such a scary thought, right? And so what is it, if anything at all, can the average person do instead of feeling disempowered? How do you take the power back?
Well, unfortunately for most of the ailments and the cure often takes an expense from our side. It means we have to make a greater effort in getting to talk to our neighbors, to say when we might not be home during the evening hours so that they can keep a watchful eye on our properties. So we need to be building a street by street, block by block community. I have in my street, for example, there are young men who come outside and they put out camping chairs and they sit outside and have a conversation, and they basically sit on the corner talking to each other, and at the same time they cast a watchful eye over the community and over our street. There's also an expense for us now to start acquiring solar products. Products that hopefully has a battery backup or depends on the sun to keep something charged, and often that's perimeter lights, or we need to make sure that we have at least one light in our house. We also find that alarm batteries are not lasting 1 year, 3 years, or 6 years like they normally do. They last a few months because they are constantly recycling and they cannot replenish the power that's in the battery, so it depletes the battery, and essentially we have to go on to the additional cost of acquiring additional batteries every few months or so. It also means that for some of us, we pay a little bit more for private security to protect our perimeter and do street patrols at night. The funny thing about alarms is that alarms, often 80 to 90% of alarms are false alarms. So we've got to be vigilant when we just don't get into the habit of believing that when our alarm goes off that it's false. That means security companies are simply going to call you, they're going to ask what's going on, and if you say, well, I think it's because load shedding and the alarm is set back in, they may not respond. And what we see is that the South African Police Service, when they get somebody who calls the service and says, there's somebody that I don't know in somebody's yard, they come out. They don't call you first. So we've got to be sure that when we have a contract with a security company, they just don't assume that what is happening is that your battery is resetting or your alarm is resetting or load shedding is in some way affecting your electronics at home and especially your alarm, but that they actually do their due diligence and come out and do a check.
Yeah, that's if you
So
have the luxury.
all of these measures have an expense for us.
Sure, and that's if you have the luxury of an alarm. But in the absence of that, you mentioned to have at least one light on in the house. Why is that important? Well,
often what we understand from people who commit opportunistic crimes is that they are less likely to approach a house if they believe that the occupants are still awake and they are able to respond to a noise. Now, what happens with noises outside? You and I hear something, or our neighbor hears something. They hear a noise. They wait for a repeat of that noise, and if there is no repeat, that's when they go about their business. We are now having to develop the habit of when we hear a noise, we should go to our windows and we should check on our neighbors' homes and we should check on his own homes. We should go outside and look outside, which means that we need a high-powered torch, at least in the home. We need one light to ensure that we're saying there's someone present, and that we also may need that light to be moving around the house as we move around to show that there's actual movement. Because thieves are also a lot more smarter and saying, oh, they just left a light on to throw us off from the fact that they are there, right? Or they may not be home. So we now have to do additional measures to ensure that we're showing that we're home and that we're vigilant. We also need stronger locks on our doors, and we need to make sure that we store away our valuables and don't leave them laying around our house. And unfortunately, if we have a vehicle, we need to make sure that we show that there's nothing in our vehicles. The other day, I heard a noise outside my home. I looked through my window, and sure enough, there was somebody looking in our cars with a torch. Initially, I thought it was a torch, but what he was doing is using the torch, the flashlight of his phone to look into the vehicles that is in our street to see if anybody left valuables there. By the time, of course, that I unlocked my door and I went outside, he had disappeared in the dark. Yet I have to then tell my neighbors that this is a pattern and that they mustn't be leaving things laying around the house. Talk to our neighbors, make sure that our doors are locked, our valuables are stored away, and if we're storing them inside the house, understand that thieves know that putting things in a sock drawer or sticking it in your freezer, they actually look in those places in the 10, 15, 20 minutes they have in your home. They understand where we routinely hide things. So we need to be a little bit more creative in terms of where we put away not just our jewelry, and other such trinkets, but also via anything that can link us to who we are and to our identity, because identity theft is also on the increase, because they find passports, they find ID documents, and they in fact use this with the credit cards that may be around to clone our identity and then to commit crimes that requires an identity.
Just hearing you speak makes me feel some type of way, and not in a good way, right? So you speak of maybe taking that torch or whatever and going outside and checking when you hear a noise. Is that advisable? Now, I speak maybe for, there are women who live on their own and they have children, you know, maybe, and you don't have a neighbor, you don't live in a village that is a village, you know, where people are all together and huddled together. There's no community WhatsApp group. Is that advisable?
It isn't. Anytime that we may feel vulnerable, which is why I think earlier we said lock your doors and make sure that the door locks are not cheap Chinese knockoffs, and I'm sorry to say China, but we may buy it at China Mall, or we may buy the cheapest we can. Buy the most secure and most expensive lock you can. Invest in a good lock. Invest in a good door. And most of our RDP structures or our structures in our informal townships are not secure in and by themselves. Where we can, we need to invest in good protection, unfortunately, and spend that extra money. Where you are alone, sure, get something that can make a noise. We get these portable sirens. Use that. Years ago, we used to give people whistles. Get something that makes a noise, or keep batteries in your radio and then crank up your radio so that somebody is aware that somebody inside has heard them and they are likely to hopefully run away if at least there's some perimeter protection.
Okay. Eldred De Klerk is a crime expert. Thank you so much for your time.